So, Chinese fast fashion giant Shein is slated to make a re-entry into India in a few weeks. The company, widely popular across the world for its here and now fashion and cheap clothes, is among a bunch of Chinese companies that were actually banned by the Indian government in 2020. That was an aftermath of India's deadly clashes with the Chinese armed forces on the Himalayan border that year. Shein also had its own alleged problems, which we shall discuss in a bit. But now is being brought back to India by Reliance Industries. India's biggest conglomerate would hope for Shein to make a dent into the rapidly growing fast fashion segment in which its rival Tata Group, by the way, has been making significant strides. Now this time, Shein has a strict license agreement with Reliance under which Reliance will own the domestic business while Shein will offer production support. The company will also train over 25,000 local suppliers so that they can produce Shein-branded products globally. Most critically, all data generated in and for the business will be stored and handled in India by Reliance. Interestingly, Shein isn't the only Chinese entity that's being allowed into India. Dixon Technologies, India's largest electronics contract manufacturer, is planning to take a 74% stake on a joint venture with China-based display firm HKC. On the other hand, the Adani Group has formed a subsidiary in China to provide supply chain solutions and project management services. Adani's Singapore-based step-down subsidiary has actually formed its own wholly owned unit, Adani Energy Resources Shanghai, for this business. It was formed on the 2nd of September. So, how will the Shein story pan out in India, and how will the company keep the government's intrinsic concerns about Chinese companies at bay? And what intrinsic concerns? Are those concerns slowly dissipating? Is the entry of other Chinese companies into India a sign of its changing stance towards its contentious neighbor, at least as far as business is concerned? Let's find out. It's Friday the 13th of September. I'm your host Anirban Chaudhary. This is the Morning Brief. First, I spoke to my colleague and TMB co-host ET Prime Shobari Das, who has done some deep dive reporting on the Shein story. Here's us. Hi Shobari, very warm welcome to the Morning Brief, this time on the other side. Very happy to see you as a guest.
Thank you so much for having me, Anirban. It's definitely strange to be on the other side of the microphone. Let's put it that way.
Okay, so we are discussing something that you've reported on pretty extensively, which is Shein. And Shein has made a re-entry into India. But before discussing that, why don't you tell me about the first time that it came to India? Was fast fashion as big as in India then as now? And what was the reception like?
Yeah, you're right. I did some reporting back in 2019 about Shein as well. So let's rewind a little bit, right? Shein entered India in 2017. Back then, because there were no issues with Chinese app in India, you could just download it like any other app from the Google Play Store or the Apple Store. And they were extremely well received back then. The entry of fast fashion, or rather the category, was started developing in India back in 2010 when Tata's launched Zara. So Shein follows the same business model. They're a fast fashion brand, except they are really fast. So back then, when they were launched, within a year, they had nearly 5 million downloads as per Google Play. And they were catering to nearly 20,000 orders per day. So back then, Shein was doing really well. And it was actually, a lot of people were really upset when they were shut down or banned in the country, actually.
And why was it banned in the country? What was the circumstance? I mean, as far as I know, it wasn't only because it was a Chinese company, right?
Troubles for Shein started brewing back in 2019. And to be specific, it was on June 20th, 2019, when issues started happening for the company, because Mumbai Customs authorities ended up seizing 500 Shein orders in a single day. And those 500 Shein orders contained nearly 17 tons of apparel, cosmetic jewelry, fashion accessories like bags and shoes, you name it, it was all there, right? And the seizing happened because of multiple reasons. Number one, customs tariff law in India taxes any, B2C transaction, that is like if you're ordering from an e-commerce platform which is outside of the country, at 42.08% on the order value. The same thing for a B2B transaction, the taxation margin is lower. It's between 30 to 35%. Okay. And the third thing, which is extremely important to know, is that if the B2C transaction is of an order value of less than 5,000 rupees, you're not taxed. Okay.
Mm-hmm.
One of the things that apparently drove Shein's growth was the fact that their products were so cheap that you could buy like 5-6 things in the same order and still have an order value of less than 5,000 rupees. So you're not paying any taxes or anything and you're getting it. The second thing that, again, allegedly Shein did was they started masking a lot of their B2C transactions, apparently, as B2B transactions. So their Indian arm is called Sino India Retail Private Limited. It's in Andheri, Mumbai, and it's a warehouse. So they were sending multiple products, multiple as in multiple orders, under the same package. And that package was addressed to Sino India Retail Private Limited.
Mm-hmm.
And when this product will reach India, it will go from the customs to the Sino India Private Limited warehouse. And there the package will be opened. And there used to be a barcode. And these guys will scan the barcode and the final address of the consumer will come out. And then the delivery will happen. The result was the combined effect of making a B2C transaction allegedly into a B2B transaction. Their customs became lesser by almost 10 to 12%. And then there was a partial ban on them. And eventually in 2020, the ministry decided to just ban all the 58 Chinese apps. And Shein was one of them. So based on my reporting at that point of time, this is what I had learned. And it was quite fascinating to me. Yeah.
Tell me how Shein is doing exceedingly well in global markets, right? But is it not facing any regulatory challenges, say, in Western markets like the US and EU because of its practices?
More than regulatory issues, I mean, honestly, they are getting into a lot of trouble because of the product itself. I mean, fast fashion is an environmental hazard. And both Shein and there's another Chinese retailer called Temu, they were under the radar. Apparently, their products have some 269 units plus or 269 times more toxins that are allowed in products. So the way they're manufacturing the products also is under a lot of... I don't know. They're definitely under the microscope right now.
So let's talk about Reliance and what it means for the conglomerate. It's been very aggressive in the retail space. So fast fashion was just another sort of bastion that it would want to conquer, so to speak. But then there is a competitor here, the Tatas, which has also been doing very well in fast fashion with Zudio and other brands. What do you think Shein's re-entry in partnership with Reliance means for Reliance plans in this space?
Okay, so couple of things before I would want to mention before we get into how it impacts the Indian fast fashion market. Shein's global revenue for FY24 was close to $45 billion. Their profits were close to $2 billion. Okay. Now, the reason why this is important is because according to Redseer, the total fast fashion market of India is estimated to be $10 billion as of FY23. Now, the India's total fast fashion market contributes about 7.5% of the total fashion retail market. And it's growing at about 30 to 40%, which is much faster than the total apparel market, which is growing at about 6%. Now, when we talk about the market leaders, Tata Zudio, hands down, is like absolutely killing the market right now, right? They already have 559 outlets. Their revenue was grew by almost 51%. Their profits grew by 159%. Reliance Retail, it was literally only a matter of time that Reliance enters this category because of the numbers that it is exhibiting, right? Now, Reliance has its fast fashion brands. They have brands like Outright and Cover Story, but they don't have iconic global fast fashion brand yet. So the partnership with Shein actually makes a lot of sense. So the fast fashion competition in India is going to boil down between Zara versus H&M versus Urbanic versus Shein. So yeah, India is literally just about opening up to global fast fashion war.
Now, like I said, Shein isn't the only Chinese company coming back to India. There's the Dixon HKC JV on the anvil. Also in August, an inter-ministerial panel approved about 5 investment proposals from China in the country's electronics manufacturing sector. These include companies such as Luxshare, a Chinese firm that supplies to Apple, and a joint venture between Micromax and China's Huaqin technology. And then there's, of course, the Adani subsidiary that I spoke about a while back. So, what is really happening here? To understand this, my colleague, TMB co-host and ET's tech expert Diya Rekhi spoke to Amit Bhandari. Amit is a public policy researcher who works at Gateway House, Indian Council on Global Relations, which is a foreign policy think tank. Amit has done extensive work on Sino-Indian business relations. He was the lead author of Gateway's 2020 report called Chinese Investments in India, which looked at China's penetration of India's startup ecosystem. Here's Diya and Amit.
Thank you so much, Amit, for joining us on the morning brief. It's an absolute pleasure to have you. To begin with, just wanted to get your thoughts on what we are seeing now with the government sort of, you can say, warming up to letting in some Chinese investments and approving some of the pending investments. Just wanted to start off with asking you how you view this in the larger scheme of things, if we can begin there.
Restriction on Chinese investments in India, that came about in 2020. And this was just at the beginning of the pandemic. And there were 2 or 3 concerns at the time. First, that because of the lower valuations and the drop in market, there could be hostile takeovers. And I think the second issue was that there was a lot of Chinese investments going on in Indian startup companies, and a lot of which have access to data, a lot of which were in the media space and could therefore be used to influence people and views. So these, I think, were the larger concerns. And then, of course, there was the border issue. So I think after 4 years, that action was taken in an emergency. And now that there is some time to think about it, it is clear that not all investments are equal. An investment in a media company or a finance, let's say a fintech company, is not the same as, let's say, an investment in a textile factory. So that is one reason why there is a rethink. And the second factor that there is a rethink is because India is trying to create an ecosystem of certain industries, especially in electric vehicles and so on. And many of these companies are Taiwanese, and many of them have suppliers which come in from China. So that, I think, is the other factor.
And now with this sort of opening up of investments, how do you see it sort of impacting the larger ecosystem in India? Do you feel it's a positive? Do you feel it's required? How do you view that?
I would say that it is a positive thing in the sense that if we make it easier for certain kinds of Chinese investments, because it shows that it is not a blanket ban on China in any way, but it is clearly thought of action taken for a very specific purpose. So, for example, in India, we do not permit FDI in newspapers, just to take an example. Likewise, there is a case for restricting certain kinds of investments in certain crucial sectors. And I think that was a call which was taken in 2020. And now that there is more time to think about it, that action can be fine-tuned. So I would say this is a positive thing.
The other thing, Amit, is that, you spoke about having an understanding or a demarcation of which are some sectors where, there should be more leniency in allowing Chinese investments, and, which are some places where the government can look at being more strict. Can you break that down for our listeners? Which are the sectors that you feel the government can look at, say, light touch regulation?
So on face of it, let's say there are certain sectors which can clearly be off limits, and media is a good example. And I think in the current scenario, the dividing line between media and non-media in the tech industry is actually quite narrow. So I think that is something which is very clear-cut. Any sector which involves data of a very large number of consumers should technically also be off limits, especially because that data may get out of India. It could be misused. So, for example, a fintech company has access to a lot of information about you, right? If I know who you have borrowed money from, how much you owe, that is information which can be misused. So there has to be a great deal of sensitivity about certain sectors such as these. Now, let's say that if you want to come in an industry such as plastic or textiles, that is a single point investment with a very specific purpose that doesn't affect anyone. So that is clearly on the other extreme. Somewhere in the intermediate would be, let's say, sectors which are specifically industries which support areas such as electric vehicles or chip manufacturing, which India is really trying to get big on. Many of these manufacturers come with their own ecosystem suppliers, and these suppliers on occasion may be Chinese. And I think we have to be able to find a way to make it work.
What about when it comes to electronic? We are seeing that some electronics manufacturing investments are coming through. And when it comes to electronics specifically, Amit, can you give our listeners an idea of the fact that you could have a Taiwanese electronics manufacturing company, but a lot of their components are Chinese, are from Chinese suppliers. So
Yes.
how will that work? And when India is looking at such an ambitious target of really going after the electronics manufacturing sector, how important is it to have those kinds of suppliers to come in?
So, okay, let's look at what is it without delving deeper into technology. Let's look at it. Where do we stand now? Currently, we are importing these electronics, and the components as they stand are pretty much being made in China, the parts that we are talking about. So in theory, what we are talking about is that instead of having these parts being made physically in China, we are talking about having some of the manufacturing here in India, which probably in the longer term gives us a certain amount of leverage. Perhaps, and this is being slightly ambitious, in the long run, it may also mean that some of that know-how may also get into India, although that is being extremely ambitious. But I think having some of that manufacturing in India provides a certain level of leverage. And as things stand, in the current state, we are anyway importing the goods directly from China.
In terms of the work that you have done, you've written extensively about Chinese investments in India. Can you give us some numbers as to what that landscape looks like and how you see that going forward?
In 2020, when we looked at Chinese investments in India, we found that the bulk of that investment was really taking place in the tech sector in Indian startups. So I think at that time, there were around 30 odd Indian startups, and which were considered unicorns. 18 of them had a Chinese investor on board. And I think there were about 100 plus Chinese investments in different Indian companies. Very few investments were there in the physical manufacturing segment. So that is one. The second part is, if I look at the world in 2020 and even today, the most valuable companies in the world at that time were really the tech companies. Amazon, Facebook, Google in the US, and Alibaba and Tencent in China. So having a substantial stake or a majority stake in these companies controlled by a non-Indian entity, it does present a risk. You are really talking about companies which potentially be the most valuable Indian firms of the future, not having an Indian owner or an Indian majority owner, and in fact having a Chinese owner. So that clearly was a strategic risk. So having China out of the startup industry really means that a future Indian Amazon, if there is going to be one, will definitely not have Alibaba as the controlling shareholder. It doesn't affect anything immediately, but it really affects the landscape 10 or 15 years down the line. So I think that purpose has really been accomplished, one. Two, I think in the last 3 or 4 years, there has been a significant crackdown in China on its own tech sector. We have seen Jack Ma almost vanish from public eye for almost a year after he made some comments about a regulator. So that, I think, clarifies also the relationship many of the Chinese companies have with the government. The argument was made that these are private Chinese companies. I think there is a better understanding that there isn't anything which is truly private in China. The government exercises an enormous degree of control.
So far as investments are concerned, especially in certain sectors, how do you see that? How do you see the government looking at this? Are we going to see more Chinese investments coming in now? Do you feel that this is sort of just a one-off thing, or is it the beginning of allowing more Chinese investments coming in? I mean, we saw that whole thing with MG Motors as well, right? Is the JV the only way to go for Chinese companies now?
Okay, so let's look at it this way. There are certain industries where China is clearly a leader. Electric vehicles is clearly one of those. And obviously, JSW is a steel company. They are the partners for, I think, MG in India. JSW is clearly not going to be a company that can develop an electric car in the next, given the business it has been in. So the only way it can gain an expertise is through the JV route. That is also very clear. The third part is that can India leverage its large market somehow to force Chinese companies to form JVs and do a certain transfer of technology? This is something that China did very effectively in the 1990s and 2000s with a lot of foreign collaborators, especially in the auto sector. So this is something which we can also try to do. Let us also remember that China is not a market economy. This is not something, they are not a market economy. And they have pretty much used this model to create their own industries as well. And this is something which we can try to use on them to achieve similar outcomes, hopefully.
So Amit is clearly optimistic about what can be seen as a slight thawing of Indo-Chinese business relations. Elsewhere too, things may be changing, although very, very slowly. For instance, on Tuesday, American and Chinese military commanders spoke to each other in a rare telephone call between the two parties. What did they talk about? An intent to repair military communications between the two countries that had been cut more than 2 years ago. In another part of the world, the European Union, as we all know, has been engaged for years in a tit-for-tat trade tariff war with China. But countries like Spain are now asking for a moderation. The Spanish Prime Minister, Pedro Sanchez, just hours ago, said that his country is reconsidering tariffs on Chinese electric vehicles. He also said that there needs to be a quote-unquote compromise between EU and China, at least where business is concerned. Clearly, these statements, small conversations, and approvals may not be all too consequential in fundamentally changing how India does business with China. But this space will certainly be interesting and something to track in the near future. That's it for today. You were listening to this episode on The Morning Brief. It was produced by Surohini Jain, sound designed by Indranil Bhattacharjee. A new episode of TMB drops every Tuesday, Thursday, and Friday. Listen to it and our new daily financial news roundup 7 at 7, that's 7@7, wherever you get your podcasts. This is your host Anirban Chaudhary signing off. Thank you and have a good weekend.